Good evening, everyone. Tonight I'm going to do a review of a very special episode of the first season of the Twilight Zone from 1959, and it particularly has significance to me because it's the episode that was broadcast the closest to my birthday. It was the 11th episode. It was broadcast on December 11th, 1959, and I was born on December 22nd of 1959. The next episode was not, which was What You Need, was not broadcast until Christmas. So this is actually the closest to my birthday, and that is And When the Sky Was Open, based on a 1953 story by Richard Matheson called Disappearing Act, teleplay by Rod Serling, directed by Douglas Hayes, and starring Charles Aidman, Rod Taylor, and Jim Hutton. And it's a story, I will read you the intro because I think it's rather brilliant, and I'm going to do my best Rod Serling voice here, not as a form of mockery, but actually as a form of respect, because I had great respect for Serling as a writer, and I wish I had gotten to meet him. Unfortunately, he passed away in 1978 during open heart surgery, no doubt exacerbated by the fact that he smoked 5 packs of cigarettes a day for about 20 years. But here's the intro. Her name, X-20. Her type, an experimental interceptor. Recent history of crash landing in the Mojave Desert after a 31-hour flight 900 miles into space. Incidental data. The ship, with the men who flew her, disappeared from the radar screen for 24 hours. And then you see a scene of the X-20 covered by a tarpaulin in a hangar. And then you see Colonel Clegg Forbes, who is played by Rod Taylor. And Serling goes on with the intro. He says, "But the shrouds that cover mysteries are not always made of a tarpaulin. As this man will soon find out on the other side of a hospital door." Colonel Forbes opens the hospital door, and he's going to visit Major Clegg, Gart Williams, who is played by Jim Hutton, because he broke his leg in the crash of the X-20, and still in the hospital. He and his fellow astronaut Ed Harrington were released because they only had minor injuries. And he comes in and he's talking to Major Williams, and he's asking him, how are you? How are you feeling? He says, "Oh, well, I'm fine." So, and Williams says, "But what about Ed Harrington? How is he? Did you find him?" And he says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Ed Harrington, the third man on our crew." And he says, "I don't know who you're talking about. I don't know anybody named Ed Harrington." So, come on, you've known Ed Harrington. Stop pulling my leg. You've known Ed Harrington for 15 years. He was the best man at your wedding, for Christ's sake. And he says, "I'm telling you, I don't know a man named Ed Harrington." He says, "Wait a minute. Do you remember when we were released, when you two were released from the hospital, what you did?" And he says, "Sure, I remember." He says, "Tell me, what do you, he says, "Tell me." He says, "Okay, I'll tell you." And he starts telling him about what happened. He and Ed Harrington were released from the hospital, and they went to a bar. And in this bar, the bartender was buying them free drinks, because they're famous astronauts now. And they start chatting up this pretty girl played by the beautiful Gloria Paula, gorgeous, voluptuous blonde. And they're telling her about what it's like out in outer space. All of a sudden, Colonel Harrington says, I don't feel well. I feel weird." He says, "What do you mean weird?" He said, "I don't know. I feel like I'm not supposed to be here." And Forbes says, "What do you mean? What do you mean you're not supposed to be here?" He says, "I don't know. I can't explain it." He says, I need to go, talk to my friends." He says, "Oh, come on, have a beer first." And he says, "Okay." And the bartender pours him a beer, and he tries to pick it up, and his hands are shaking. He drops it, and the beer glass smashes on the floor. He says, "Oh, don't worry. I'll get you another one." And he goes to the phone booth to make the phone call to his parents. And when he comes back, he's like ashen. And Forbes says, "What's the matter? What's wrong, Ed?" And he says, I spoke to my parents. I spoke to my mother, and I know it was her voice. He says, "But she told me," he says, "What did she tell you?" He says, "She told me she doesn't have a son named Ed Harrington, and asked me to stop harassing her and her husband." He says, "Oh my, they're just pulling your leg, they're pulling a fast." He says, "No, there's something wrong. There's something weird. I'm not supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to make it back." He says, "Oh, come on, you're being silly, and just have your beer." But he runs out into the street. He says, "I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not supposed to be here." And he runs. Forbes runs back out after him and says, Ed, come back." And he can't catch up to him. And Later you see he comes back into the bar, and the bartender has poured him another beer. He says, "What about my buddy's beer?" He says, "What? What buddy? What are you talking about?" He says, "My buddy's beer, the one he dropped right over," and he points to where the beer glass was, and it's not there. There's no broken glass. There's no spilled beer. There's nothing. And he says to the girl, "Don't you remember my buddy, Ed Harrington? You were talking to him." She says, "I don't know what you're talking about, buddy. I was talking to you. I don't know anybody else." And he says, "You're all nuts. You're all crazy." And he runs out. And you see a newspaper that says 3 astronauts return from crash in desert. And he shows the 3 of them together in their flight suits. And then he goes out and he goes home and he's talking to his wife. He says, "The craziest thing happened to me at this screwy bar." She says, "What?" He says, "These people were pretending they didn't know Ed Harrington." He says, "What? Who's Ed Harrington?" He says, "Oh, not you too. What is this? Some kind of big joke?" He says, you know who Ed Harrington is. He used to eat dinner over here all the time. You had a crush on him in high school." And she says, "No, really, I don't know anybody named Ed Harrington." And now he's like starting to freak out. He says, "I'm going to go visit Williams in the hospital and see if he's doing okay." And she says, "Okay," and he leaves, goes to visit Williams, and he's talking to him about what happened. And he sees that there's a newspaper on the shelf. The newspaper says 2 intrepid spacemen returned from crash in desert. And it's just him and Williams. There's no Harrington. And he says, "What is this? Is this some kind of elaborate, wacky joke? Where's Ed Harrington in this picture?" He says, "I'm telling you, buddy, I don't know Ed Harrington. I never knew a guy named Ed Harrington." And he says, he starts to first start saying, I'm feeling weird. And, "I feel like I don't belong here." And Williams says, "What do you mean you don't belong here?" "I don't know. I can't explain it. I don't belong here. Something doesn't want me to be here." And he says, "You're talking crazy. I'll go get a doctor." And he rings for the nurse. It was played by Maxine Stewart. And before the nurse can get there, you see that Forbes looks in the mirror and he can't see his reflection. He freaks out and he screams and he runs into the corridor, and Williams is yelling after him. He can't run after him because he's on crutches. His leg is broken. He's going, "Forbes, come back, come back." And the doctor comes in and says, "You should be back in bed." And he says, "Did you get my buddy?" He says, "What do you mean your buddy? Nobody came out of here." He said, "Colonel Forbes." He says, "I don't know anybody named Colonel Forbes. You're the only one in this suite." And he sees the newspaper again. It says, "Lone astronaut survives crash in desert." It's just his picture. He starts freaking out, and he holds his hands to his face and looks at himself in the mirror. And he's got this horrified look on his face. Next thing you see is the doctor and the nurse are inspecting the room. And he asks the nurse, "Are there any beds we can move into the new ward for new patients?" She says, "Well, we've got these 3. We're saving them in case there are any, crashes, but there haven't been any, so I guess you can take them." He says, "Okay." And then Serling comes on and does his closing narration, which I think is just as brilliant as the opening, and I'll again read it for you in my Rod Serling voice. "Once upon a time, there was a man named Harrington, a man named Forbes, a man named Gardner. They used to exist, but don't any longer. Someone or something took them somewhere. At least they are no longer a part of the memory of man. And as to the X-20 supposed to be housed here in this hangar, this too does not exist. And if any of you have any questions about an aircraft and the 3 men who flew her, speak softly of them, and only in the Twilight Zone." I think that's one of the best episodes, and as I said, it's kind of my, special episode because it aired right before my birthday again. And When the Sky Was Opened, December 11th, 1959, from the Twilight Zone.